Having served his full sentence, the man walked out of prison and hurried to his fiancée's grave. But as soon as he leaned over the headstone, he froze in shock. Ethan woke up drenched in sweat again, his chest heaved as he tried to steady his breathing. It was the same dream. Always the same dream. He and Kate were walking hand in hand through a sunlit field, surrounded by blooming daisies swaying gently in the breeze. She looked back at him, her laughter like a melody he could never quite capture. The warmth of her hand in his was so vivid, so real, that he could almost believe she was still there. Then, as always, she slipped away. "Catch me!" Kate called out, her voice bright and teasing. He laughed and ran after her, the daisies brushing against his legs as he sprinted to close the gap between them. But then, she started to fade, her figure blurred, as if she were becoming part of the haze that now surrounded them. "Kate!" he called, panic seeping into his voice. She turned to him one last time, her features soft and indistinct, and whispered something he couldn't hear. And then, she was gone. Ethan froze, his breath caught in his throat. He turned in every direction, frantically searching for her, calling her name. But there was nothing but an endless expanse of daisies, their white and yellow blooms mocking his despair. He would wake up then, gasping, his heart pounding so fiercely it felt as though it might burst. His fists were clenched so tightly his nails left crescents in his palms. His teeth ached from grinding them in his sleep. Every time the anguish hit him anew, like a fresh wound tearing open, because the dream was a cruel reminder of reality. Kate was gone, and it was his fault. 5 years, 5 endless tormenting years in prison. And in all that time, the dream never stopped. It followed him like a shadow, a nightly punishment that felt more fitting than the sentence handed to him by the judge. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. 5 years. It wasn't enough. He'd told the judge that himself during his trial. "Your Honor," he'd said, his voice breaking, "I don't deserve mercy. Kate is gone because of me. She trusted me and I failed her. I took away her future, her smile, her everything. If I could trade my life for hers, I would do it without hesitation. Please, give me life." But the judge hadn't listened. They'd called it an accident. They'd said there was no intent, no malice. They'd given him 5 years. A slap on the wrist, Ethan thought. He deserved worse. Much worse. And now the sentence was over. The day had come. The guards led him to the gate, their footsteps echoing in the corridor. He carried nothing but a small bag of belongings, a few letters, a photograph of Kate that he couldn't bring himself to look at, and a change of clothes. When the prison gates creaked open, the sunlight hit him like a punch to the face. It was blinding, too bright, too free. He took a hesitant step forward, the weight of the world pressing on his chest. Behind him, the gates clanged shut with a finality that made his stomach churn. Freedom. He was free. But for what? Ethan didn't head straight to the bus stop after leaving the prison. The road stretched out before him, yet every direction felt like a dead end. He wandered aimlessly through the unfamiliar streets near the prison, his footsteps heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The world outside felt larger and more overwhelming than he remembered. It was loud, bustling, alive, a stark contrast to the cold, rigid monotony of his life behind bars. He needed time to think, to gather his thoughts. But about what? Where would he go? The options were few and uninviting. His parents' small village seemed the only possibility. They had written to him occasionally while he was incarcerated, offering forgiveness he didn't think he deserved. Still, they were all he had left. Yet even the thought of returning to them felt hollow. He wasn't needed by anyone. Not by society, not by his family, not even by himself. Ethan found a narrow alley near the bus stop and sat on a worn wooden bench. It was quieter there, removed from the chaos of the main street. He leaned back, closed his eyes and let his memories take him. 5 years ago, his life had been so different. He had loved and been loved. He and Kate had met in a gym where Ethan worked as a trainer. It was a modest place, not one of the flashy modern facilities, but it was enough to keep him busy and pay the bills. One evening he noticed an exceptionally beautiful young woman walk through the doors. She stood out instantly, her confidence blending with a slight hesitancy as she approached the counter. Her long dark hair framed a face that seemed more at home on a magazine cover than in a dimly lit gym. Ethan watched from a distance as she signed up for her first session. It wasn't long before he was introduced to her. Kate. She didn't really know what she wanted, just that she wanted to get fit, because it was trendy. Ethan smiled at her honesty. "You don't seem like you need much work," he joked lightly, noticing how effortlessly graceful she was. She laughed, a laugh that stayed with him long after that evening. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became her trainer. He suggested strengthening exercises, demonstrated the proper way to use the machines, and crafted a plan to help her feel stronger and healthier. Kate listened to him intently, always eager to learn and quick to smile. Their sessions soon became less about workouts and more about conversations. She told him about her studies, her family, her dreams. He shared stories of his small-town upbringing, his past as an athlete, and his passion for coaching. And they discovered something deeper between them, something magnetic. It wasn't just physical attraction, though that was undeniable. It was the way her eyes lit up when she laughed at his corny jokes, the way his heart raced whenever she walked into the room. Before long, they were spending time together outside the gym. Their relationship blossomed, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt truly happy. He was falling for her, and he knew she felt the same. But Ethan also knew they came from different worlds. Kate's parents were influential and affluent. Her father was a prominent banker, her mother the chief doctor at a prestigious private clinic. Kate herself was in her final year at a top university, studying law with ambitions to join a high-profile firm. Her life was a carefully constructed path towards success, mapped out by years of privilege and opportunity. And Ethan? He was just a failed athlete from a small village. His promising weightlifting career had been cut short in his 5th year at university. A routine medical exam before a major competition revealed a heart condition, not immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to end his dreams. Doctors were shocked it hadn't been caught earlier, but for Ethan, the timing couldn't have been worse. He was devastated. The sport that had defined his life, given him purpose, and promised him a future was suddenly ripped away. He graduated from university, but his name was never mentioned in competitions again. Instead, he turned to coaching, spending his days training kids, glamorous women, and scrawny young men chasing dreams of muscles and six-packs. It paid the bills, but it wasn't the life he had envisioned. Ethan had always viewed his job as a stepping stone, a temporary means to an end. He dreamed of one day owning a gym like the one where he worked, a place where he could build a community, coach aspiring athletes, and finally feel like he'd achieved something worthwhile. But back then, it was just that, a dream. He had no one to lean on for support. His parents, his mother a farm worker, his father a tractor driver, did what they could in their small village, but there was no extra money to spare. If Ethan wanted a better life, he would have to carve it out on his own. That determination fueled him. He took every extra shift he could at the gym, worked late into the evenings, and even picked up small side jobs when he had the chance. His hard work paid off, allowing him to buy a modest apartment and a second-hand car. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Still, he craved more. He wanted to build a life that would make his parents proud and prove to himself that his earlier setbacks wouldn't define him. Then Kate walked into his life and suddenly, everything changed. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met before. She was vibrant, confident, and exuded a quiet grace that captivated him. At first, he thought she was out of his league, a wealthy, spoiled girl accustomed to a life he couldn't imagine. but he couldn't help being drawn to her. Their connection deepened quickly, and before long Kate became Ethan's greatest motivator. For her, he was willing to work harder than ever. He picked up extra clients, extended his hours, and poured every ounce of energy he had into building a life that could meet her expectations. His colleagues noticed his relentless drive and often warned him. "Ethan," one of them said one evening as they wiped down the equipment, "you can't earn all the money in the world. Slow down before you burn out." But Ethan didn't listen. How could he? For Kate, he wanted to move mountains. Still, their love wasn't without its challenges. The first came when Kate introduced Ethan to her parents. Irene, her mother, was polished and elegant, the kind of woman who could cut you down with a glance. She barely concealed her disdain when Kate mentioned Ethan's humble upbringing. Graham, her father, offered a smirk that was equal parts condescending and dismissive. They said little during that first meeting, but their judgment was palpable. Later, Graham confronted Kate privately, giving her a stark ultimatum: leave Ethan, or he would cut her off financially. But Kate was nothing if not determined. She refused to be swayed, telling her parents she was leaving their home to be with Ethan. The very next morning, she stood at his apartment door with a suitcase in hand. Ethan blinked at her in disbelief, his heart racing. "Kate? What are you doing here?" "I'm moving in," she said simply, her chin held high, though her eyes shimmered with both resolve and uncertainty. He hesitated for a moment, processing the weight of what she was saying. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "You're serious?" "Completely." Ethan laughed, pulling her into his arms. "To hell with the challenges," he whispered. "We'll figure it out. Together." And they did, at least for a while. Kate graduated from university with flying colours and landed a great job soon after. Graham's threats to cut her off proved hollow. He continued transferring money to her account, and even, Ethan suspected, pulled strings to help her get the job. While Kate brushed off Ethan's concerns, it gnawed at him. "Doesn't it bother you," he asked one evening, as they sat on the couch eating takeout, "that your dad's still pulling strings for you, even after everything?" Kate laughed and leaned against his shoulder. "Ethan, don't overthink it. He'll come around eventually. You'll see. You two will be friends one day." Ethan wasn't so sure, but he wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that one day he'd earn Graham's respect, that the man would see him as more than just the farm boy from a small village. Despite the tension with her parents, life with Kate was good. She was his anchor, his inspiration, his reason to keep pushing forward. So when he finally proposed, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Kate's face lit up with joy as he knelt before her, holding out the simple but elegant ring he'd saved up for months to buy. "Kate," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "will you marry me?" Her answer came instantly. "Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes." He couldn't stop smiling for days after that. He took her to his parents' village soon after to introduce her. Ethan's parents greeted them with the warmth of small-town hospitality. His mother, Anna, had prepared a feast as though celebrating a holiday. Golden pies filled with berries and meat, a beautifully roasted duck with crispy skin, a hearty stew that simmered for hours, and fresh bread straight from the oven. Every dish was made from scratch, the flavours rich and comforting. Ethan's father, Oliver, had fired up the sauna earlier in the day, his Finnish roots making him an expert in the art. The small but immaculate sauna was ready to welcome them, its heat carefully regulated, the birch whisks already prepared. It was a ritual he cherished and hoped to share with his son and future daughter-in-law. Kate, however, found herself overwhelmed by the rustic charm of it all. She had never experienced life in the countryside before, and while she was polite and curious, she was also clearly out of her depth. "Wow, this is something else," she remarked as they walked through the yard. She hesitated when the neighbour's geese honked loudly and waddled too close for her liking. "Are they supposed to do that?" Ethan chuckled, guiding her away. "They're harmless, just territorial." She shot him a skeptical glance. "They look like they want to attack me." The evening took an awkward turn when Pete, the local drunk, caught the scent of Anna's feast and lingered near the yard, calling out to Ethan. Pete was known for his boisterous nature, but tonight his presence was unwelcome. Ethan sighed, excused himself, and approached Pete with a firm tone. "Pete, not tonight, okay? My parents have guests." Pete scratched his head, mumbling something unintelligible, until Ethan discreetly slipped him a little cash. "Go grab yourself something and head home, all right?" Pete grinned and staggered away, waving over his shoulder. "You're a good man, Ethan." Returning to Kate, Ethan shrugged. "Welcome to village life." "What a wild place," Kate exclaimed, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Ethan smiled. "You're wrong. It's beautiful here. Sure, it's different, but everywhere has its quirks." Kate's lips curved into a confused smile, but she didn't argue. At dinner, however, her discomfort was more evident. Anna, eager to please, kept offering Kate slices of pie and generous servings of duck and stew, her enthusiasm unrelenting. Kate tried to smile, but her cravings were for something entirely different: seafood, preferably crab. Here, the closest thing to crab was imitation crab sticks from the village store. She nibbled politely but didn't hide her lack of appetite as well as she thought. The sauna, too, was a source of awkwardness. "How do you even bathe in there?" she asked Ethan honestly, eyeing the wood-panelled room with skepticism. "It's not just for bathing, it's relaxing," Ethan explained patiently. "Trust me, it's good for you." But Kate didn't look convinced. It wasn't the modern spa-like sauna she might have imagined, but to Ethan it was perfect, clean, well-kept, and full of memories from his childhood. Still, he didn't push her. She was trying, and that was what mattered. Despite the cultural divide, Ethan's parents embraced Kate with open hearts. As they said their goodbyes, Oliver pulled Ethan aside. "She's a good girl," he said quietly, clapping his son on the shoulder. "Bring her here more often. She'll grow to like it." Ethan smiled, hopeful. "I think so too." Perhaps she would have. Perhaps she would have learned to love the village's quirks and charms. But tragedy intervened before she had the chance. The drive back to the city started peacefully. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple as Ethan and Kate chatted about the visit. She teased him about the geese, and he joked about her sauna experience, their laughter filling the small car. But as they approached the city outskirts, their car was suddenly cut off by a speeding SUV. The vehicle swerved dangerously close, forcing Ethan to jerk the wheel sharply. His small, aging car veered off the road. The last thing Ethan remembered was the sickening sound of crunching metal, the shatter of glass, and Kate's scream. Then, silence. When Ethan regained consciousness, he was in a hospital room. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above him, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. His head throbbed and his body ached, but none of it mattered. He turned to the nurse by his bedside, his voice hoarse. "Kate," he croaked. "Where's Kate?" The nurse paused, her expression softening, but she said nothing. She busied herself adjusting the IV drip, avoiding his gaze. Panic began to bubble in Ethan's chest. "Please," he begged, "tell me, is she okay?" The nurse hesitated but didn't answer. A doctor arrived shortly after, checking his vitals and murmuring reassurances. But when Ethan asked about Kate, the doctor simply patted his shoulder and left the room. The truth came not from a caregiver, but from the investigator who arrived later that day. The man sat down beside Ethan's bed, his face stoic but his words unyielding. "Mr. Bennett," he began, his tone grave, "I'm sorry to inform you, but Kate didn't survive the crash." Ethan stared at him, the words refusing to sink in. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible. She was right next to me. She can't be gone." The investigator's expression didn't change. The impact was severe. She died instantly. Ethan's chest tightened, and his breath came in ragged gasps. "No," he said again, louder this time. "It's not true." But the man continued, his voice cold and clinical. Preliminary findings suggest you were driving too fast for the road conditions. I'm afraid the responsibility falls on you." Those final words struck Ethan like a hammer. Responsibility? His fault. His mind spiraled into chaos, replaying the crash over and over. He'd been careful, hadn't he? Or had he let his guard down, distracted by their laughter and the joy of the weekend? Shock turned to guilt, and guilt turned to despair. Kate was gone, and the investigator's words echoed endlessly in his mind. It was Ethan's fault. But then, a sliver of doubt crept into Ethan's mind. Was it really his fault? The SUV had cut him off so suddenly, surely that had been the real cause of the accident. He tried to cling to the thought, but the investigator's unyielding stance crushed it. "We've reviewed the scene thoroughly," the man had said, his voice as cold as the hospital walls. "There's no evidence to implicate the other vehicle. You lost control, Mr. Bennett. That's what caused the crash." From the hospital, Ethan was transferred to a detention centre, and soon after, his case went to trial. The courtroom became a stage where guilt and blame were dissected and debated, though Ethan himself barely participated. The prosecutor was relentless. They presented every detail with precision, painting a picture of reckless driving and negligence. The skid marks on the road, the condition of Ethan's aging car, the testimonies from witnesses who claimed to have seen the crash, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Ethan had been driving too fast and failed to maintain control. Ethan's court-appointed lawyer, by contrast, seemed detached. He spoke in measured tones, offering little resistance to the prosecutor's arguments. Ethan hardly noticed. He sat in the defendant's chair, numb and hollow, unable to focus on the words flying around him. The proceedings felt like a distant murmur, overshadowed by the image of Kate's face, her laugh, her last scream. It didn't matter what the SUV driver had done. It didn't matter that Ethan had tried to avoid the collision. In his heart, he was certain of one thing: Kate had trusted him, and he had failed her. She was gone because of him. He barely heard the judge's voice as the verdict was delivered. 5 years. It was almost merciful compared to what he felt he deserved. The courtroom blurred as his gaze shifted to his parents. His mother's face was streaked with tears, her hand clutching her husband's arm. His father, Oliver, sat motionless, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the floor. Ethan's guilt deepened. Not only had he failed Kate, but he had brought shame and sorrow to the two people who had always believed in him. Kate's parents were not in the courtroom, citing health reasons for their absence. Ethan was relieved. He couldn't have borne their accusatory gazes, or worse, their grief. He didn't need their words or their presence to condemn him further. He was already drowning in self-reproach. The years in prison passed slowly, but with agonizing clarity. Ethan relived the accident every day, each detail replaying in his mind with cruel precision. The screech of tires, the blinding lights, the shattering glass, and the deafening silence that followed. It was all etched into his memory, an unrelenting torment. While the law declared that his debt to society had been paid after 5 years, Ethan knew better. The weight of Kate's death was a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. He didn't care about the legalities. To him, his sentence had been a mere formality. Justice hadn't been served, not for Kate, and not for himself. Even after walking out of prison, a free man by definition, Ethan didn't feel free. Freedom, he thought bitterly, was for the living. And though his body still drew breath, a part of him had died in that crash. The part of him that had dreamed, hoped, and believed he could build a life with the woman he loved. "Hey, buddy, got a smoke?" The raspy voice jolted Ethan out of his memories. He flinched and turned toward the sound. A shabby-looking man stood by the bench, his clothes frayed and stained, his face weathered by time and hardship. The man's expression was a curious mix of hopefulness and weariness. Ethan hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a pack of cheap cigarettes. He flipped it open and handed one to the stranger. The man's face lit up with gratitude as he grabbed the cigarette and, without asking, sat down beside Ethan. He struck a match and lit it, the first puff of smoke curling lazily into the air. "Just got out, huh?" the man asked, exhaling slowly. Ethan's shoulders tensed, but he nodded silently. "I see," the man said knowingly, taking another drag. "So what's the rush? Not heading home?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze drifting back to the pavement. "Yeah, I get it. Not everyone gets a warm welcome, you know. No music, no people waiting with open arms." The man chuckled. "Got nowhere to go?" "Why wouldn't I?" Ethan replied, his voice clipped. "I'll go to my parents' place." "Ah," the man said, nodding. "Parents, huh? They're the only ones who'll always take us in, no matter what. What about a wife? Kids?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Listen, why do you care?" he snapped. "Why are you prying into my life?" The man raised his hands in mock surrender, his cigarette dangling precariously from his fingers. "Hey, sorry. None of my business. Just saw you sitting here looking like hell and thought I'd lend a little support." "My bad." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have snapped at you. It's just... I feel like hell, okay? What's your name?" "Been called Ron for the last 10 years or so," the man replied, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "Well, Ron, I don't know how to go on with my life." And just like that, Ethan opened up. He told this complete stranger everything about Kate, their love, and the tragic accident that had taken her away from him. Ron listened quietly, his cigarette burning down to the filter as he sat motionless, absorbing Ethan's words. When Ethan finally stopped, his voice trembling, Ron flicked the butt into the bushes and spoke. "You need to see your Kate," he said matter-of-factly. "Make peace with her. Maybe then, your soul will find some rest." "What?" Ethan stared at him incredulous. "Are you crazy? How am I supposed to see her?" "Go to the cemetery," Ron said with a shrug. "Ask the gatekeeper where she's buried. You remember the details, don't you? Sit by her grave. Pour out your grief. Talk to her. You might feel better. Maybe even figure out how to keep living. Whatever happens, life goes on, buddy." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of Ron's suggestion. Ron's attention shifted as he spotted an approaching bus. "Hey, the 15! That one goes straight to the city cemetery. Go on, take it." Ethan turned to see the bus pulling up to the stop. He hesitated, torn between skepticism and the nagging feeling that Ron might be right. Finally, he nodded. "Thanks," Ethan said, his voice soft but genuine. Ron gave him a lopsided grin. "Good luck, buddy. And remember, life doesn't stop for anyone." Ethan stood up and ran toward the bus, which had just begun to pull away. He banged on the side and the driver grudgingly let him on. The conductor gave him a practiced look as he handed over his fare. "The cemetery is the last stop, right?" Ethan asked. "Uh-huh," the conductor replied, staring out the window with disinterest. Ethan found an empty seat and pressed his forehead against the glass. The city blurred past him, but his thoughts were far from the present. Memories of Kate filled his mind, her smile, her laugh, the way she had looked at him with unwavering trust. He clenched his fists in his lap, his nails digging into his palms. Maybe Ron was right. Maybe this was the only way to find peace, not forgiveness, but at least some semblance of closure. The bus rattled on, carrying Ethan closer to the cemetery, closer to the answers, or the reckoning that awaited him. By the time Ethan reached the cemetery, the last visitors were already leaving, their figures silhouetted against the fading light of dusk. The stillness of the cemetery was unsettling, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. At the gate stood an elderly man with a fluffy white beard and remarkably kind eyes. His round face, rosy cheeks, and the slight twinkle in his gaze made him look like Santa Claus, minus the red coat and sack of gifts. Instead, he wore a heavy grey jacket and a battered hat that shaded his weathered features. "Hello, sir," Ethan said hesitantly. "Are you the gatekeeper?" "That's me," the old man replied with a nod, his voice warm and friendly. Name's Caleb. What can I do for you? I need to find a grave. It's my fiancée's, Ethan said, his voice catching slightly. Can you help me? She should be buried here. Caleb's expression softened, and he gave a solemn nod. I'll do my best. What's her name? Ethan gave Kate's full name, along with her date of birth and date of death. Caleb scratched his beard thoughtfully before gesturing for Ethan to follow. Come along, young man. We'll check the records, Caleb said as they began walking toward his small office, a modest structure tucked near the edge of the cemetery. As they walked, Caleb mused aloud, his tone tinged with melancholy. Your fiancée, you say? What a shame. So young. Had her whole life ahead of her. Life can be cruel, can't it? Ethan swallowed hard, the words slicing through him like a knife. He didn't reply, keeping his gaze on the gravel path beneath his feet. Caleb seemed to sense his grief and fell silent for the rest of the short walk. Inside the office, Caleb flipped through a large, weathered ledger with practiced ease. His fingers skimmed the pages, and in no time, he found the information Ethan needed. Ah, here we are, Caleb said, tapping the page. Sophia Caldwell, plot 47, just down that way. Ethan blinked. Sophia Caldwell? Her name, Caleb replied, nodding. I see the dates match the ones you gave me, more or less. That's odd, Ethan muttered, his stomach tightening, but he said nothing more. Let me guide you, Caleb offered, standing up with a grunt. These paths can be tricky to navigate in the dark. Besides, it'll save you some time. Ethan hesitated but agreed. The cemetery was vast, and Caleb's familiarity with its layout was helpful. He followed the old man through the winding pathways, past rows of graves in various states of care. Some were well tended, adorned with fresh flowers and polished headstones, while others were neglected, consumed by weeds and time. As they approached the plot Caleb had mentioned, Ethan's steps faltered. From a distance, the grave didn't look right. The plot was overgrown with weeds, its edges uneven and untended. There was no stone monument or fence, just a simple wooden cross, its paint peeling from exposure to the elements. Ethan's heart sank as he stepped closer, dread creeping into his chest. This can't be Kate's grave, he said, his voice uncertain. I'm telling you it's the right one, Caleb replied firmly. Look, there's a photo on the cross. Sophia Caldwell. Born September 21st, died May 17th. Poor girl, only 20 years old. Such a beauty. Ethan froze. She was 23, he said automatically, his mind racing. Not so, Caleb said, huffing slightly. Look at the dates, young man. Ethan stepped closer, his pulse pounding in his ears. The gatekeeper pointed to the small inscription on the cross. The name and photograph were undeniably Kate's. But the dates, they were off by 3 years. The photo stared back at him, unmistakably her. It was the same radiant smile, the same soft features he'd memorized long ago. Yet, the numbers didn't match. Ethan's mind reeled. How could this be? Why were the dates wrong? He turned back to Caleb, his voice trembling. This doesn't make sense. Are you sure this is her grave? Caleb's brows furrowed as he looked at the records again. I double-checked, young man. This is the plot registered under her name. Mistakes like this, well, they don't usually happen. But life's full of strange things, isn't it? Ethan's legs felt weak, and he sank to his knees before the grave. His hand brushed against the wooden cross, his fingers tracing the faded paint and the uneven letters etched into the surface. His heart told him this was Kate's resting place, but the discrepancy gnawed at him, adding a new layer of confusion to his grief. Something was off, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of uncovering it. The only people who could give Ethan the answers he needed were Kate's parents. He hesitated at first, knowing the meeting would be anything but pleasant. There was a good chance they'd turn him away without a word. Yet, he couldn't ignore the nagging questions clawing at his mind. He had to try. As the golden hues of the September evening faded into twilight, Ethan arrived at the gated luxury neighborhood where Kate's parents had lived when he last knew them. The exclusive area was as pristine as he remembered, its grand homes nestled behind high fences, each one guarded like a fortress. From the bus stop, he walked briskly to the security checkpoint at the neighborhood's entrance. Before he could speak, a uniformed guard stepped out of the booth, eyeing him suspiciously. "Hey, buddy, what are you hanging around here for? Move along before there's trouble." "I'm here to see Graham Aldridge," Ethan said, trying to sound firm but polite. The guard frowned. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Graham Aldridge," Ethan repeated, his tone sharpening. "The owner of Aldridge Terminals. He used to live here." And recognition flickered in the guard's eyes, but he didn't budge. "Look, I think it's been a while since they moved out of here. I'm new, but I heard they packed up after their daughter died." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Do you know where they went?" The guard shrugged. "No idea, but hold on." He stepped back into the booth and made a call. A brief conversation later, he returned. "Yeah, they moved upstate, but that's all I know. Sorry." The news sent Ethan into weeks of searching. Finding the Aldridge family's whereabouts turned out to be far more difficult than he'd anticipated. For a family so prominent, they had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase their trail. Dead ends and unanswered calls became his routine, but Ethan refused to give up. Finally, his persistence paid off. He tracked them to an exclusive private estate upstate. Like their former home, it was well guarded, the checkpoint manned by uniformed personnel who scrutinized everyone entering and leaving. When Ethan arrived, his rented car was immediately flagged down at the gates. "State your business," one of the guards demanded. "I need to speak to someone from the Aldridge family," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. The guards exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. "You're mistaken," one of them said flatly. "The Aldridge family doesn't live here." Ethan's heart sank, but something about the guard's tone set off alarm bells in his mind. They weren't being truthful. He could feel it. He drove off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the Aldridges were indeed behind those gates. Determined, he returned a few days later, parking at a safe distance from the entrance. This time, he had come prepared with a pair of binoculars. He settled in, keeping a low profile, and began watching the checkpoint. Hours passed with little activity beyond the occasional delivery truck or luxury car entering or leaving. Ethan's patience was wearing thin when a sleek black sedan pulled up to the checkpoint. His attention snapped to the vehicle, his binoculars trained on it. The driver's side window rolled down, and a young woman leaned out to speak to the guards. She removed her sunglasses, revealing her face. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His hands trembled, making the binoculars wobble. Kate. It was her. Sitting behind the wheel as alive as he was. Her lips moved as she spoke to the guards, who smiled and waved her through without hesitation. The car rolled forward, disappearing behind the gates, but Ethan remained frozen, unable to process what he had just seen. Ethan's mind raced, but he forced himself to stay calm and watch. Kate looked different. Her face was slightly fuller, her golden blonde hair now a rich chestnut brown. But there was no mistaking her. It was her. It had to be. He waited, his pulse pounding in his ears. Minutes passed like hours before the same sleek sedan pulled out of the residence. This time Ethan didn't hesitate. He jumped out of his car and sprinted toward the gates. "Kate!" he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "Kate!" The woman in the driver's seat turned her head, startled by the commotion. Their eyes met, and, for a fleeting moment, Ethan thought he saw recognition in her expression. Her lips parted as if to say something, but then she hesitated. The moment broke as the window rolled up, shutting him out. The car sped away, leaving him in its dust. "Kate!" Ethan screamed again, now running after the vehicle, his arms flailing in desperation. But he didn't get far. A firm hand grabbed his arm, yanking him back. He twisted around to see one of the guards from the checkpoint, his face set in a scowl. "Get back!" the guard barked. Another guard joined in, and together they shoved Ethan roughly away from the gates. He stumbled but managed to stay on his feet, his chest heaving with frustration and disbelief. "Get lost, or we'll call the cops," one of them threatened. "You'll end up right back where you came from." The two men stood there blocking the path, their hands resting on their belts as if daring him to defy them. Defeated and overwhelmed, Ethan took a shaky step back, his mind spinning. Kate was alive. Alive. He staggered back toward his car, his legs trembling beneath him. How was this possible? He had spent 5 years in prison for her death, 5 years, only to see her alive and well, driving out of a guarded residence as though nothing had happened. Each step felt heavier than the last as questions flooded his mind. He remembered how, during the investigation, he had been too consumed by guilt to pay attention to the details. In court, he hadn't listened to the evidence, hadn't scrutinized the arguments. He'd simply accepted the prosecutor's case, convinced he deserved whatever punishment they deemed fit. And yet, there had been a glaring inconsistency. The victim's birth year. Off by 3 years. He'd noticed it at the grave but dismissed it in his anguish. How could he have overlooked something so important? If Kate wasn't dead, then he wasn't responsible for anything. So why had he spent 5 years behind bars? Why had no one corrected this mistake? Or worse, was it intentional? Ethan sat in his car, his head resting on the steering wheel, trying to calm his ragged breathing. He needed answers, but right now the only thing he knew for certain was that he had to see his parents. The night train ride to his hometown was a strange mix of soothing and tormenting. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels provided a backdrop to the storm of thoughts churning in his mind. Had he really been imprisoned for nothing? Ethan had always known deep down that the accident wasn't entirely his fault. The SUV had cut him off, forcing him to swerve. But he hadn't fought the charges or argued his innocence. His guilt over Kate's death had been too overpowering. He had believed that simply losing control of the car was proof of his failure. But now, the truth gnawed at him. He had been made to pay for a crime he hadn't committed, for a tragedy that hadn't even happened. 5 years of his life, gone, stolen. How could this have happened? Why had no one stopped it? Early the next morning, Ethan stepped off the train at the tiny station near his village. The cold morning air hit him like a slap, waking him fully. The station was eerily quiet, the building still closed as the workday hadn't yet begun. He glanced at his phone. The next bus to his village wouldn't arrive for 2 hours. His breath puffed in the cool air as he stared down the empty road. His village was 10 miles away. He didn't have enough money for a taxi, having spent what little he had left to rent a car during his search for Kate's parents. Ethan made his decision. He slung his bag over his shoulder, stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets, and started walking. The entire walk home, Ethan's thoughts circled back to the encounter at the checkpoint. Could he have imagined it? Maybe it wasn't Kate. His mind toyed with the possibility, but deep down he knew the truth. He remembered her face too vividly, the curve of her jaw, the colour of her eyes, and that unmistakable flicker of surprise and fear when their gazes met. No, it was her. It had to be. The village came into view just as the sun peeked over the horizon. A small herd of cows was lazily making its way down the road, their bells clanging softly. Ethan stepped onto the narrow dirt path near the line of modest houses, letting the animals pass. The village looked the same as he remembered, its peacefulness now seeming almost foreign after the chaos of the last few years. "Ethan, is that you?" a voice called out, startling him from his thoughts. He turned to see a familiar figure standing by a house with a blue fence. It was Derek, his childhood friend. Once inseparable, life had led them down very different paths. Derek, now taller and broader than Ethan remembered, looked at him with a mix of surprise and joy. Without hesitation, Derek jogged over and pulled Ethan into a firm hug, his enthusiasm undeterred by Ethan's tired and shabby appearance. "So, they let you go?" Derek asked carefully, stepping back to study him. Yeah, Ethan replied with a smirk, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Free as a bird. Derek nodded, his expression softening. Man, we were all in shock when we heard. You got a raw deal. But don't worry. Things'll get better now. Hey, swing by the office later. The office? Ethan asked, confused. Yeah, I'm the police officer now, Derek said, puffing out his chest slightly. You? Ethan's eyebrows shot up. How did that happen? You never talked about joining the police. You hated authority. Derek laughed. Yeah, life's funny like that. Did my service in the army, came back home and was figuring out what to do. Started as an assistant officer, worked my way up, and now I'm official. They even have me studying part-time to climb the ranks. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. Wow, you really turned things around. Derek grinned. Enough about me. Go see your parents. They'll be so happy to see you. Ethan nodded, though his smile wavered. Happy? Their son, the ex-con. But he couldn't have been more wrong. The moment Ethan stepped through the gate of his childhood home, his mother came rushing out of the house, her hands flying to her mouth when she saw him. Tears streamed down her face as she threw her arms around him, holding him as if she would never let go. My boy, she sobbed, her voice thick with emotion. You're home. You're finally home. Ethan hugged her tightly, his throat constricting. I'm home, Mom. His father appeared next, his usually stoic face breaking into a rare smile. He pulled Ethan into a firm embrace, clapping him on the back. Good to have you back, son, he said, his voice steady but warm. Ethan stood there, overwhelmed by their genuine joy. They didn't look at him with pity or judgment. They didn't hesitate, didn't ask him why he hadn't fought harder or blame him for the years lost. Instead, they welcomed him back with open hearts. Inside, the house was exactly as Ethan remembered, small, cozy, and filled with the comforting aroma of his mother's cooking. His parents avoided bringing up his time in prison altogether, and for that, Ethan was grateful. He couldn't yet bring himself to talk about it, not when the wounds were still so raw. Instead, they talked about the village, about Derek's surprising career path, and about the new family that had moved into the old Miller house. His father mentioned a good harvest this year, while his mother insisted on cooking him a big breakfast despite his protests. Ethan sat at the kitchen table staring into the cup of tea his mother had placed in front of him. The warmth of home surrounded him, but it couldn't dull the storm raging in his mind. No matter how hard he tried, the memory of Kate's face, the fear, the recognition, the way she had driven away, wouldn't leave him. Finally, he broke the silence. I need to tell you something, Ethan said, his voice low and hesitant. His parents exchanged glances, their smiles fading as they sensed the seriousness in his tone. It's about Kate, he continued. She's alive. His mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Alive? What are you saying, Ethan? How is that possible? We buried her, didn't we? Ethan shook his head, bitterness creeping into his voice. I don't know how, but I saw her. At a gated neighborhood upstate. It was her, Mum. She looked different, but I'd recognize her anywhere. His mother's expression darkened. Ethan's father, ever the quieter one, leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. Tell us everything, he said calmly, from the beginning. Ethan relayed the events, the unkempt grave at the cemetery, the inconsistency in the dates, the search for the Aldridge family, and the moment he saw Kate at the checkpoint. As he spoke, his mother's outrage grew while his father remained composed, listening carefully. That deceitful woman! How dare she let you suffer like that? Something must be done about this. Ethan's mother's voice trembled with indignation. When Ethan finished, he let out a long sigh. But what can I do? He asked bitterly. I confessed. I didn't fight the charges. I served my time. Now what? Who's going to believe me? His mother slammed her hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. It doesn't matter what they believe. You were wronged, Ethan. They took 5 years of your life. 5 years. And that woman. She's been alive this whole time, living in comfort while you were behind bars? No, this can't go unchallenged. Ethan's father rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Go to Derek, he said finally. Tell him everything. He's the police officer now. He'll know what to do and where to take this. Ethan hesitated. Derek had been a good friend once, but this was no small favor to ask. Would he believe him? And even if he did, could Derek do anything about it? The next day, Ethan went to the police department to meet Derek. The small town station was quieter than he expected, with only a few officers milling about. Derek greeted him warmly, ushering him into his small office. So, what's on your mind, Ethan? Derek asked, leaning back in his chair. Ethan took a deep breath and told Derek everything. About Kate, the unkempt grave, the inconsistency in the dates, and the gated neighborhood where he'd seen her. Derek listened intently, jotting down details in a notepad. When Ethan finished, Derek sat back, a frown etched on his face. Man, that's heavy, Derek said, rubbing his forehead. But before we start stirring up trouble, let's try something simple. He reached for his phone. Let's see if she's on social media. Ethan watched as Derek scrolled and searched, his fingers moving quickly over the screen. There, Derek exclaimed, holding the phone out for Ethan to see. Ethan's stomach dropped. There she was, Kate, alive, healthy, and smiling. Her profile photo showed her in a garden, her chestnut brown hair cascading over her shoulders, a happiness in her eyes that Ethan hadn't seen in years. Her last name now included a hyphen, and among her photos were snapshots of her with another man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure holding her close. One photo in particular caught Ethan's eye. It was of Kate with a little girl, no older than 2, her golden curls framing a cherubic face. The caption read, "My sweet daughter." She's definitely alive and well, Derek noted. Looks like she's married, and that's her kid. Ethan stared at the photos in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest. How? How could this happen? Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe it's just someone who looks like her. Derek shook his head. You know it's not. We'll figure this out. Ethan's hands balled into fists as he fought to steady himself. I need to talk to her, he said decisively. I'll message her, see what she says. He glanced at Derek. Can I use your account? My phone's been locked for years. I'll sort it out tomorrow. Sure thing, Derek said, handing him the phone. Go for it. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before typing out a message. Hi, Kate. It's Ethan. Looks like you're doing well. I just spent 5 years in prison because you were supposed to be dead. Care to explain? He hit send and sat back, his chest tight with anticipation. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as he waited, Derek sitting quietly across from him. Finally, the message was marked as read, and a reply came swiftly. Where are you now? Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he typed back, At my parents' place. Kate's response came almost immediately. I'll come by tomorrow and explain everything. Her words erased any lingering doubts. She didn't even ask for the address, she already knew where he lived. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn, his thoughts churning. He couldn't stop wondering what Kate would say. Would she have an explanation that made sense? Could she somehow be a victim in all of this too? Or was the truth as devastating as it seemed? Judging by her cheerful photos, Ethan's instincts leaned toward the latter. The thought made his stomach churn. At breakfast, Ethan told his parents that Kate was coming. His mother's lips pressed into a tight line, while his father shook his head in frustration. Look how fast she decided to come, his father muttered. Must feel the heat catching up to her. Let's not judge her yet, his mother said gently, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Let her explain herself. Sure, his father snorted. Bake her some pies while you're at it. Maybe she'll appreciate them this time. She'll manage without pies, his mother said firmly, though her worried gaze lingered on Ethan. Son, just keep calm no matter what. Don't let her provoke you into doing anything rash. Ethan gave her a sad smile. Mum, I'm not some hothead. Don't worry. I'm not planning on going back to prison. I'll listen to her, hear what she has to say, and figure out what to do next. After lunch, the sound of tires crunching on gravel caught Ethan's attention. He stepped outside just as a sleek luxury SUV pulled up in front of the house. The passenger door opened and a woman stepped out. Her hair was now chestnut brown, styled into sleek waves that framed her face. Yes, Kate was now a brunette. But this wasn't his Kate. The woman before him was cold, distant, and unfamiliar. She turned to the driver, saying something in a sharp, commanding tone, before heading toward the gate. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as she entered the yard. He took a step toward her but froze. She stopped too, standing a few feet away, her eyes scanning him, not with recognition or affection, but with wariness, as if she were assessing a stranger. Her gaze was sharp and calculating, her posture stiff. It was clear she was deciding how to begin this uncomfortable conversation. "Hello, Ethan," she said finally, her voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "Hello?" Ethan's voice trailed off. He barely recognized the woman standing before him. "Where can we talk?" she asked, glancing around as though the very sight of the yard offended her. "Anywhere you'd like," Ethan replied, gesturing toward the old gazebo in the corner of the yard. "Or inside the house." She curled her lips slightly, a faint sneer that instantly reminded Ethan of Kate's mother, Irene, the same disdainful expression she had worn when they first met. "The gazebo will do," she said, her tone dismissive. Ethan led the way, his heart pounding. They sat across from each other in the wooden gazebo, its peeling paint and worn beams a stark contrast to her polished, designer-clad appearance. Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan studied Kate, searching for some trace of the woman he had loved, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. Instead, she stared off to the side, nervously fiddling with the strap of her expensive handbag. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I served time for your death," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "Your murder." "Ethan, don't be so dramatic," Kate snapped, her fingers tightening on the strap of her bag. "What's done is done. We can't change the past." "I understand we can't turn back time," Ethan said, his voice growing strained. "But you can at least explain. Why did this happen? Why did you let me—" Kate cut him off. "Promise me you won't make a scene," she asked, her tone both pleading and firm. "Are you joking?" Ethan's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "I spent 5 years in prison for nothing. Do you have any idea what that did to me? What it's like to have a criminal record? To know that no matter how hard I work, people will always see me as an ex-con. And now you're telling me not to make a scene?" Kate flinched but quickly recovered, fixing him with a cold stare. "How much do you want?" she asked abruptly. "What?" Ethan was taken aback, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "How much money do you want to let this go?" she continued, her voice steady and emotionless. $500,000? 1? 2? I can give you 5 million, and you'll never have to see me again. You can live your life in peace." "You came here to buy me off?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Call it whatever you like," Kate said indifferently, "but it's a good offer." Ethan stared at her, a hollow ache spreading through his chest. This wasn't the Kate he had loved. That woman, the woman he had wanted to spend his life with, was gone. In her place sat a stranger, cold and calculating, who saw him as nothing more than a problem to be solved with money. "I don't want your money," Ethan said quietly, lowering his head. He couldn't bear to look at her anymore. "I want the truth." Kate's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment she looked almost bored. "Suit yourself," she said, standing up and shrugging. "Just remember, you won't be able to prove anything. You confessed and served your time. There's nothing you can do." "No," Ethan said firmly, stepping in front of her to block her path. His voice was low but resolute. "You're going to tell me everything. Otherwise you're not leaving. Understand this. I've got nothing left to lose. I've been through it all already." Kate's eyes widened, fear flickering across her face. She studied him carefully, weighing the sincerity of his words. Ethan was bluffing, of course. He would never harm her, but he wanted to scare her, and it worked. She believed his threat. "Talk," he demanded. Kate's haughty demeanor crumbled. Her shoulders sagged and her lips quivered as tears welled in her eyes. "Fine," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You want the truth? I'll tell you." She sank back into the bench, her composure shattered, and began sobbing. Ethan sat down across from her, his heart pounding as he waited for her to speak. The night of the accident was one that Kate could never forget, no matter how hard she tried. It had been a clear evening, the air crisp and cool as she and Ethan made their way back to the city. She remembered the easy banter between them, the occasional playful argument over the music on the radio, and the warmth of Ethan's smile. Then came the blinding headlights, the deafening crash, and the sickening screech of metal against metal. When Kate opened her eyes, she was in shock. The car was a mangled wreck, the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber filling the air. She was unscathed, but Ethan lay slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious and bleeding. Her heart froze, panic surging through her veins as she tried to shake him awake. "Ethan! Ethan! Wake up!" she cried, her voice trembling. But before she could do anything else, another figure emerged from the shadows. She recognized the towering silhouette immediately, her father. His face was pale, his usually composed demeanor replaced with frantic urgency. "Kate!" he called, rushing toward her. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, but Ethan, he's not waking up," she said, her voice breaking. "Dad, we need to call an ambulance." But Graham wasn't listening. His attention shifted to the SUV parked a short distance away. Its front end was smashed, steam rising from the engine. The passenger side door hung open, and someone was slumped in the seat. Catalina. Kate's heart sank. She knew who Catalina was. The rumors about her father's affair with the young foreign student weren't just gossip. They were true. Catalina had been around long enough for Kate to know her as troubled and unpredictable. She was impulsive, dramatic, and prone to disappear for weeks at a time. "What happened?" Kate asked, her voice shaking. "Kate," Graham said urgently, grabbing her shoulders. "Listen to me. Catalina, she's gone. She didn't make it." "What?" Kate gasped, her stomach lurching. "But how?" "I was driving," Graham admitted, his voice raw. She was upset, high on something. She grabbed the wheel. "I lost control." He gestured toward Ethan's car. "This is my fault. I hit you. But we can't let this come out. Do you understand?" Kate stared at him in disbelief. "What are you saying?" "I have connections," Graham said, his voice trembling with desperation. "I can fix this. I can make it look like Ethan was at fault. He was driving recklessly, lost control, and caused the accident. We'll say he killed you, Kate. It's the only way." Kate's head spun, her father's words barely registering. "You want me to let Ethan take the blame?" she whispered. "Dad, he's unconscious. He doesn't even know what's happening." Graham's grip on her shoulders tightened. "Kate, listen to me. If this comes out, I'll lose everything. My career, my reputation, it'll destroy me. And Catalina. If people find out about her, the scandal will ruin us." "What about Ethan?" Kate shot back, her voice rising. "He'll go to prison, Dad. He's innocent." "I know," Graham said, his voice breaking, "but he's not my family. You are. I need you to trust me, Kate. Please." Kate looked at Ethan, slumped and lifeless in the driver's seat, then back at her father. Her mind raced with the weight of the decision before her. Ethan was the man she loved, the one she had dreamed of building a life with. But Graham was her father, the man who had raised her, supported her, and begged for her help now. The look in his eyes, pleading, vulnerable, was one she had never seen before. "Dad, I can't—" "You can," Graham interrupted, his voice firm. "And you will. For the family, Kate. For me." Hours later, when the police arrived at the scene, the story had already been set. Graham's connections moved swiftly. Statements were forged, evidence was planted, and the narrative was clear. Ethan had been speeding, lost control, and caused the crash. Kate was declared dead, her body reportedly unrecoverable due to a mix-up at the morgue, a detail Graham had orchestrated to perfection. Kate's role in the cover-up was simple: disappear. She had to vanish from Ethan's life entirely, start over elsewhere, and let her father handle the fallout. At first, she tried to fight it. What if Ethan figures it out? What if... He won't, Graham assured her. He'll be too consumed by guilt to question anything. He'll confess because he'll believe it's his fault. And Graham was right. Ethan, broken by grief and guilt, never fought the charges. He barely listened during the trial, accepting his sentence without resistance. It was exactly as Graham had predicted. In the months that followed, Kate tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing. She moved far away, changed her name, and started a new life. But the guilt gnawed at her, no matter how much she tried to bury it. Now, as she sat across from Ethan, the truth finally out in the open, Kate felt the full weight of her actions crashing down on her. "I didn't want to do it," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "but I didn't know what else to do. My father begged me, Ethan. He said it was the only way." Ethan stared at her, his face pale with anger and disbelief. "So you let me go to prison for something I didn't do," he said coldly. "You let me believe I killed you." "I thought I was protecting my family," Kate sobbed, "but I realize now that I was just protecting my father's lies." Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You destroyed my life, Kate. You and your father. Do you even understand that?" "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And I'm so sorry." "Sorry?" Ethan laughed bitterly. "Sorry doesn't give me back the years I lost. Sorry doesn't erase the hell I went through." Kate wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "Ethan, please, I'll do anything to make it right. I can help you start over, "I don't want your help," Ethan said, his voice hard. "I want the world to know that I'm innocent. That's all I want." Kate's eyes widened. "Ethan, no. If this comes out, it'll destroy my father." Ethan's gaze was unyielding. "Your father destroyed me. Now it's his turn." Kate looked at him, her expression a mixture of despair and resignation. She knew there was no stopping him now. And for the first time, she realized that she couldn't run from the truth any longer. The fallout from Kate's confession was swift and brutal. Her father, Graham, faced public disgrace when the truth came to light, though his powerful connections allowed him to escape significant legal consequences. His reputation, however, was ruined, and the Aldridge name became a symbol of corruption and deceit. For Kate, the unraveling of her family's legacy was only the beginning of her hardships. Her husband, who had always seemed devoted, revealed his true colours when he realised Kate was no longer a wealthy heiress, backed by her father's fortune. One evening, he packed his bags without warning. "You're nothing without your father," he said coldly as he stood by the door. "I thought I married someone with power, someone who could offer me a future. But now you're just ordinary. I'm not wasting my life on this." Kate, stunned by his cruelty, could only watch as he left. Her daughter, too young to understand, clung to her leg, asking where Daddy was going. Kate held her tightly, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. With her father disgraced and her husband gone, Kate found herself utterly alone. Yet in the silence of her empty house, she began to reflect. For the first time, she fully grasped the depth of the pain she had caused Ethan, and for the first time, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for the life she had lost, but for the one she had destroyed. One morning, weeks after her confession, Ethan arrived at Kate's door. She answered, surprised to see him there, but her expression softened when she saw the familiar kindness in his eyes. "Can I come in?" he asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've been thinking," he said, "about everything you told me, about Catalina." Kate froze, unsure where this was going. "What about her?" "I want to visit her family," Ethan said. Kate's eyes widened. Catalina's mother is in Spain. She doesn't know everything. My father made sure of that. But if you want to go, I'll come with you. The journey to Spain was a somber one. Catalina's mother, Maria, welcomed them with open arms, unaware of the full circumstances of her daughter's death. Over a simple meal in her modest home, Maria shared stories about Catalina. She spoke of you often, Kate, Maria said, her voice filled with warmth. She told me how kind you were, how much you helped her when she felt lost. She said you were like the sister she never had. Kate's breath caught. She said that? Maria nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I know my Catalina made many mistakes, but she always spoke highly of you. She said you gave her hope. Ethan listened intently, astonished. He had assumed that Catalina had been nothing more than Graham's mistress, but Maria's words painted a different picture. As Maria continued, Kate admitted something Ethan had never known. Catalina wasn't just my father's mistress, she said quietly. She was lost. A young student far from home, struggling with addiction, and my father took advantage of that. I didn't agree with what she and my father were doing, but I saw her pain. I tried to help her where I could. I bought her groceries, helped her with her schoolwork, even got her into rehab once. Her voice cracked. I couldn't save her, though. Ethan felt a pang of admiration for Kate. Despite the choices she had made that hurt him, this was a side of her he hadn't seen in years, the selfless, compassionate woman he had fallen in love with. On the flight back, Ethan broke the silence. What you did for Catalina, he began. It was incredible. I had no idea. Kate looked at him, surprised. I didn't do enough. You did more than most people would have, he said. She may have been your father's mistress, but you saw her as more than that. You saw the person she was underneath it all. And I'm sorry, Kate. For your fate. For the choices you had to make. I don't know if I could have done any better in your shoes. Tears welled up in Kate's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. Thank you, Ethan. That means more than you know. Ethan smiled faintly. For the first time, he felt the weight of anger and bitterness lifting, replaced by a tentative sense of peace. The weeks that followed were slow but meaningful. Ethan began spending more time with Kate and her daughter. He watched as Kate worked tirelessly to rebuild her life, juggling her responsibilities as a single mother while trying to atone for her past. Her daughter, a bright and cheerful child, quickly warmed to Ethan, often tugging at his hand to show him her drawings or toys. One evening, as they sat on Kate's porch watching the sunset, Ethan reached over and took her hand. I've been thinking, he said softly, about us. Kate's heart skipped a beat. What about us? I don't know what the future holds, he said, but I do know this. I've forgiven you. And I think we can try again. Tears spilled down Kate's cheeks as she gripped his hand tightly. Ethan, are you sure? After everything I've done? Yes, he said firmly, because after everything, this, us, is what was supposed to happen. And if you'll have me, I'd like to adopt your daughter, to start over, together. Kate's sob turned into a laugh and she nodded, her heart full for the first time in years. Of course I'll have you. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in golden light, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Together they would face the challenges ahead, rebuilding their lives piece by piece, bound by love, forgiveness, and the promise of a better tomorrow.